Hello. Today I'm going to be focusing on the Mass as set by Igor Stravinsky, and specifically the first segment, the Kyrie from his Mass. Stravinsky set his Mass between 1944 and 1948. Most of Stravinsky's works throughout his career are commissioned and therefore paid for by someone. The Mass is one of the few examples that is not, and so he had to kind of work on it in between other projects where he was being paid and on a deadline. Altogether, when performed in its entirety, it's roughly 19 minutes long, and it's generally considered to be part of Stravinsky's neoclassical period. Stravinsky's career, much in a similar way to Beethoven, is kind of split into three different time periods, the beginning being the Russian period, where we get his famous ballets, the middle period being this neoclassical period, and towards the end, focusing on serialism. A note on Stravinsky: I think it's very important to point out these things because it's really important as it pertains to the piece that we're focusing on, the Mass, and specifically the Kyrie. Stravinsky was a devout Orthodox Christian, being from Russia, and he carried that faith with him through his entire life. Despite that, he chose to write his Mass in the Roman Catholic tradition. You may wonder why, and there's some differences in the rules when it comes to the Mass as it pertains to the Orthodox or the Catholic traditions. Specifically, that becomes important when we talk about the fact that Stravinsky set his Mass to include instruments. Instruments are not allowed in the Orthodox Mass, but were by this time allowed and included in the Catholic Mass. And Stravinsky, wanting to have a Mass that was able to be used in the liturgy, wrote it as a Roman Catholic Mass so he could include the instruments he wanted in his vision for his Mass. The orchestration that we see, we have obviously the mixed chorus, which is very traditional as far as the Mass goes. Stravinsky's score suggests employing children's voices for the soprano and alto parts. However, Stravinsky wrote a pretty difficult part for these children to be singing, and so in reality, most of the time we see adult professionals being hired to perform it instead. On the wind side, we have two quintets, a woodwind and a brass, although they're not the traditional instrumentation for woodwind and brass quintets. In the woodwind, we have two oboes, one English horn, two bassoons, and in the brass quintet, we have two trumpets and three trombones. Looking at the Kyrie specifically, some ways that it relates to the traditional Mass that we looked at in the medieval and Renaissance eras, and some ways that it differs. The most obvious and blatant one will be that the text remains the same. In the Kyrie, we still just have Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Of course, the most blatantly obvious difference will be that we include instruments, which was obviously not done in much of what we know about medieval and Renaissance Mass settings. Another way that we really see a lot of similarities is the way that Stravinsky uses responsorial and imitation styles in his writing for this Mass. In the beginning of the Kyrie, we get a responsorial section where we have the two quintets playing, and then we pass it to the choir to do their own thing. And then we go back to the two quintets playing their own thing, and then back to the choir. We also have long flowing phrases that we have come to expect from Masses, these long drawn out words where we have kind of melismatic features in the middle, especially in the choir. We'll get to that a little bit more on the next slide. Imitation, especially in the choir, we have the soprano sing a line, which is then imitated in the alto, the tenor, and the bass separately, kind of one after the other. And we also have mostly homophonic texture, which became more and more common as we got into the Renaissance era. Some other things, we note that, of course, this is Stravinsky. It is the 20th century, and we're not going to do everything the traditional way. Stravinsky, of course, known for being innovative and different. His Rite of Spring, when it premiered, all but causing riots. We also have some changes where Stravinsky puts his own twist on the Mass here. He's not bound to tonal harmony. Stravinsky wasn't afraid to get out of the major and minor aspects that we had gotten so used to, even in his neoclassical period. The Kyrie specifically utilizes octatonic, diatonic, and modal scales. The time signature fluctuates. We're not stuck in 3/4 as we were in a 3 feel as we were so often in medieval and Renaissance. Not even 4/4. We transition between 4/4, 3/4, 2/4 constantly throughout the Kyrie. Especially the further we get in, the more we transition between time signatures and the more it fluctuates. We have staccato in the winds that contrasts highly with the legato sections we get in the choir. We do have some legato sections in the winds, and especially in the brass we have legato, but we have the staccato in the oboe and English horn in the middle section that really contrast with this flowing text that we're getting from the voices. And finally, we end very harmonically ambiguous. We already talked about how we're not bound by tonal harmony in Stravinsky's Mass. However, he seems to be leading up to this cadence at the end that we really expect from Masses at this point, that kind of amen at the end, it feels like. And he leads to it, and then we end very harmonically ambiguous, and it feels as if we've kind of been left hanging, in my opinion. So those are some ways that the Kyrie and the Mass as a whole from Igor Stravinsky are similar and differ from the traditional style of the Mass that we've learned about.